Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for coming out today. It's really wonderful that so many people are interested in this conversation that we're going to have. There's students, their faculty, their staff, as well as local alumni here. But I also think that there are people from local high schools and college counselors who have come out to share in this conversation. So thank you all. I think clearly this topic, social mobility through education, is so important, and it's what has brought so many people out today. I am Joanne Berger-Sweeney, and I'm president of Trinity College. It's an honor to welcome you here, along with our special guest, best-selling author Paul Tough, whom I'll introduce to you along with the other panelists a little bit later. I'm going to be moderating a conversation amongst the panelists today, and it will last for about 40 minutes so that we leave times for the questions that you have in the audience. I'll call on you at that point. Just put your hand up and wait for a mic when you want to ask a question. So our special guest today is Paul Tough, whose latest book, The Years That Matter Most, How College Makes or Breaks Us, would be of interest to you even if you weren't affiliated with Trinity College, and if Trinity College had not been a focus of a full chapter in the book. It's a book that has been praised as an extraordinary, indispensable book that should be necessary reading for every student, professor, administrator, and trustee in this country. Paul is the author of 3 previous books, including How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character, which has been translated into 27 languages and spent more than a year on the New York Times hardcover and paperback best-selling list. He's a contributing author to the New York Times Magazine, where he's written extensively about education, parenting, poverty, and politics. His journalism also has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, GQ, and Esquire, on the public radio program This American Life, and on the op-ed page of the New York Times. We are happy to be welcoming Paul back to campus since he spent a considerable amount of time reporting for his book several years ago. Welcome back, Paul, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, rounding out our panel today are 2 Trinity community members who figured prominently in Paul's chapter about Trinity. Angel Pérez, Vice President for Enrollment and Student Success, and Matthew Rivera, a member of the class of 2020. Now, I'm going to read a little bit about each of them, but let's just start by saying they are both rock stars. They are absolutely rock stars for Trinity College. If you've read the book, you know a lot about Angel Pérez. Angel began at Trinity in November 2014 and has led our work in admissions, financial aid, career development, and student success. He has transformed our enrollment by adopting a values-based and student-centered approach, one that has included Trinity's Going Test Optional, instituting 4-year financial aid awards for low-income families, and eliminating barriers for first-generation and low-income students to apply. He's a trustee of the United World College, the Berkshire School, the Hartford Youth Scholars, and is a member of the Higher Education Committee of 50, a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation-funded initiative aimed at addressing higher education challenges. Welcome, Angel.
Good to be here.
Next, Matthew Rivera is a senior And as we were sitting out there for lunch, it's like, really? It's your senior year? I cannot believe how fast it's gone. But your level of involvement on campus and in the city of Hartford is truly extraordinary. Matthew was featured in Paul's book when he was a first-year student. He's a first-generation college student from the Bronx. Matthew has been a student leader on campus and an honors student at Trinity all 4 years. He is co-president of Trinity's Men of Color Alliance, a student organization that works to unify the community, and he was named a Campus Compact Newman Civic Fellow for 2019-2020. He's a motivational speaker who has shown a depth of commitment to connecting the college to Hartford and is active in organizations like Ice Cream for a Dream, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about, which encourages young people to pursue their goals and offers them an ice cream in exchange. Please join me in thanking Paul, Angel, and Matthew for engaging in this conversation today. So we would like this to be a conversation, but I'm going to start with a question to you, Paul. When you began this project, what did you think was the central issue you were trying to address?
That's a good question. I want to just say, if I can, for a moment, please, just how nice it is to be back here at Trinity and how honored I am and appreciative to President Berger-Sweeney and Angel and Matthew for being a part of this conversation, and even more so for opening the doors of the campus to me when I was reporting a few years ago. It is not easy to be written about for anyone, and it was a real gesture of trust on all of their parts to let me into their lives and into the campus as a whole. So I'm honored and appreciative and especially excited to be back. So what I was trying to figure out when I started working on this whole book really had to do with the question of inequity in higher education. So I'm interested in higher education in all sorts of ways, how it works, the way it does, why it's as expensive as it is, why there are barriers where they exist. But the issue that really motivated me in this book is why there are such profound inequities in higher education. So the most selective institutions, the ones that have the biggest endowments and spend the most on their students, their student bodies are almost entirely populated by affluent students, and there's very few low-income students at a lot of those campuses. And the institutions, the public institutions that serve most American college students, and certainly most low-income American college students, are the ones that have the fewest resources and the lowest graduation rates. And on top of that, they are the ones that, as a country, we have been defunding over the last couple of decades. So just since 2001, we've cut our funding for public higher education by 16% per student. At a moment where other countries are investing more and more in public higher education, and where all the signs in the economy are that we need more and better educated young people. So I wanted to try to understand three things. One is why that was, why those inequities existed and seemed to be getting bigger and not smaller. Second, what it was like to be a young person in the middle of this system, trying to make your way through it, especially if you came from a modest background. And third, what we might do to start to change things.
Right. So tell me a little bit about why Trinity. We know one of the chapters is about Trinity College. Why did you choose to come here?
Well, so I wanted to understand admissions. And in the early part of my reporting, I had mostly been talking to students. And when you're to high school students, high school juniors and seniors, and when you talk to students, you get the impression that admissions people are these incredibly powerful demigods up on Mount Olympus, just
They're not?
handing out admissions and crushing the dreams of some other people randomly. And then just sitting back and waiting for the giant tuition checks to roll in. And then I started talking to admissions people and realized that that is not what it feels like. In fact, I think being in admissions right now is enormously stressful, and difficult and challenging. And so I wanted to spend time with one admissions officer who both understood and could be candid about those pressures, but also was trying to change things, was trying to find ways to make admissions more fair and equitable in a moment where most institutions were heading in the opposite direction. So I heard about Angel, read some of what he had written, got in touch with him, and asked if I could come to Trinity and talk with him. And after our first conversation, I was hooked. I was convinced this was a place I wanted to spend more time. And Angel very generously not only gave me lots of insight and access to him and his work, but also introduced me to students like Matthew and lots of others who gave me a lot of perspective on what it's like to be a student here.
Right, terrific. So I'm going to ask you, Angel, how did it feel when you opened up for the first time the chapter and saw both your story as well as Trinity's story? What was your first impression when you opened the book?
It's a great question. No one really has asked me that yet. So I think I wasn't shocked that my name was in the book. I did not realize how pivotal to the story I had become. And I'll share really quickly, for me, actually, it wasn't reading the book where I got a little emotional. It was actually when I read the New York Times article, because I wasn't sure what the article was going to say or how pivotal to the story I would be. And for context, I grew up in a neighborhood in the South Bronx where when my teachers assigned the New York Times articles, I had to get on a bus and a train to go into Manhattan because they didn't sell the New York Times in my neighborhood.
Wow.
Wow.
And then I woke up
Wow.
and I was the cover story. And I had to have a moment. But you know, Paul said something which is very true. Being written about is not easy, right? And so my world got noisy very quickly. I woke up to 800 emails, not kidding, when it came out. But I did take a moment to say, wow, this is pretty extraordinary. And I'm delighted that he shared this story because I always feel like if I can share my story and inspire some young people who share that story, I think it's all worth it. So it was a little surprising, but I'm glad that we went on this journey together.
Right. So how about you, Matthew? The book captures your experiences from the first year, and now you're a senior about to graduate. Do you want to share with us how you think you might have progressed in those years while you've been here at Trinity College, or do you think that chapter is accurately capturing kind of who you are now?
Well, I feel like it's impossible to talk about my growth without talking about the growth of the college over the past 4 years that I've been here. Just the amount of resources that Trinity continues to provide and continuing to provide these resources at spaces where these students are is truly important to who I am today. You know, I've grown into a motivational speaker. I've grown to being extremely involved in the community, and none of this would have been possible without the college and without the support systems that I've built outside of Trinity as well. There was one thing that I was thinking about a lot before coming up to speak to you all today, and I realized that Trinity provided me the resources that I needed, and I was able to use the resources that I needed to build support systems that I wanted. And that's truly important to the growth that I've been able to just reflect back on over these past 4 years.
Right. So Matthew, tell me what you think you're leaving behind here at Trinity. What kind of support systems exist now that maybe didn't exist when you first arrived, and maybe that you've contributed to?
So one of them in particular, we've just opened this up this year. We have this group put together that opens and welcomes to all men of color on Trinity's campus. It's called Brotherhood. We don't have much of a good name behind it. We're in the beginning stages of it. But it's really just a space where men of color come together to talk about different issues, to talk about their days and their lives at Trinity, and really just come together in fellowship. And I feel like that's extremely important. And another really important support system that I've built at Trinity is Faith Circle. So every other Tuesday we come together and just talk about our lives and our faith journey, and really just talking to each other and just being there and just being a support system. And what I've noticed as a trend between both groups is just people talk about their experiences, and when people talk about their experiences, I don't have to go through the pain that they went through to extract the lessons that they provided me with. And I feel like that's extremely important because it allows me to continue to progress as a student without necessarily having to go through some of the trials and tribulations that certain individuals have faced on this campus.
Wow, terrific. So, Angel, first of all, I know you're proud of students like Matthew that you were able to admit, but tell me a little bit about the progress that you think you've been able to affect at Trinity since the time of even the writing of the book chapter.
Yeah, so I'll take that question and add to it. I probably would say I'm proud, but I'm proud of this community. I think obviously for the book, Paul focused on admissions and he focused on me, but this really was an entire community effort coming together, from the president saying this is the direction we want to go, from the trustees saying we are going to change course and fund financial aid literally out of their pockets, to a community coming together and saying we know we really have some work to do. And Matthew alluded to some of those things, but I would say, so we're a work in progress, right? We certainly have a ways to go, but I am proud of the fact that we've been able to admit the highest number of first-generation students, low-income students. We're much more geographically diverse than we were even 5 years ago. And the other thing I would say is I'm also really proud of how we are now transforming the student experience. We just had Tony Jack here from Hartford a couple of weeks ago, who is also featured in Paul's book, and he has challenged us to think about the fact that inclusion and admitting people is not necessarily, or admitting students is not necessarily inclusion and equity, in that we need to work on the student experience. And so proud that we've done things like create a first-generation student orientation program. We've been talking about student emergency funds. As our population changes, we need to rise up to meet the population where they are.
Absolutely. So, Paul, tell me how you think Trinity compares to some of the other institutions that were clearly a part of your research in the book. Do you feel as though our story is somewhat unique or similar to the institutions you were?
I mean, it feels unique to me, just as this is the place where I spent a lot of time, and so I got to know individuals like the three of you, which gave me, the unique character of Trinity. But I think that the challenges that Trinity faces, financially and otherwise, and the direction that the institution is trying to turn, I think are common to a lot of institutions. I mean, I think there are many institutions who are face some of the same challenges and are not trying to make the improvements that Trinity is making. I mean, one way of dealing with inequities in higher education is just to pretend they don't exist. And I think that is a strategy that a lot of institutions face, and I think in the short term that might seem to be beneficial, both because it eases your mind, but also because I think there can be some financial benefits to spending less on financial aid instead of spending more on financial aid. So I think where Trinity really stands out for me is that it is taking a long view approach to an immediate problem. The problem being both, the rampant inequity in higher education and the financial pressure that a lot of institutions are facing. And what I heard from Angel being here was that that is not a problem that you can solve overnight. That's not a problem that you can solve in 1 year. It takes a real reformation of the institution as a whole. And so I think I don't think Trinity is the only institution that's thinking that way, but I think that is something that makes it rare.
Right. And so I'm curious, were you surprised by that finding? I mean, you wonder when you started the book and you had questions about social mobility and education, and you ended up hearing Angel's story and Trinity's story in particular. Was it surprising?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it was. I mean, in some ways, I think what I learned here more than anything is how hard it is to change things. I mean, I think that I had thought I was maybe not quite part of the belief that, that admissions people were the gods up on Mount Olympus, but I did think that a lot of what was happening in terms of admissions was about individual decisions, was just about admissions officers choosing classes that had a lot more high income than low income students in them because that was what they wanted to do. That was who they were more comfortable with. And what I feel like I was surprised by and learned most from here is all of the other financial, institutional, like mathematical pressures, I think, that admissions faces and that institutions face when trying to make change. And that made me appreciate not only the work that's happening here more, but also the magnitude of the obstacles that the system as a whole faces when trying to reform.
Right. So Angel, from your perspective, having heard this, what makes the job hard?
We don't have enough time to
Yes,
even
we
begin
do.
to.
But you can start. Does that ring true?
Yeah, it does, and it resonates, and a big part of it is that there are all these sort of conflicting pressures. One of the things that I talk a lot about to this community, you've heard me talk about it, is it's all about trade-offs, right? We can't have it all because of lots of inequities that, by the way, do not start in higher education. They start all the way down in K through 12, and the way that systems are created. So we are trying to do the best we can with the resources we have. And so there is this constant push and pull to try to make sure that you try to meet as many of your goals as possible. So I feel like my job is not just bringing in a class, but also educating a community around what are those trade-offs? Who do we want to be? And then what do we need to do in order to get there, knowing, as Paul said, that it's not going to happen overnight, that this is really a journey, and that as leaders of the organization, we need to think 10, 15, 20 years out, not just about next year's class.
Right. So I certainly understand the perspective of the long-term view, but I'm going to ask you, Matthew, but you're in the middle of that change. You are an individual. You hear what people are talking about, access and who has the opportunity to come. But I wanted to read just one small quote from Paul's book. And he refers to the college years as a time when identity formation is real and genuine. So while you hear about all of these changes that are happening at a meta level, do you think that these college years have been important in forming your identity? Not just, simply where you'll work in the future, but more fundamentally who you are?
Absolutely. I feel like it's super important to use these 4 years as an opportunity to figure out who you are for the sole purpose that there's so many different perspectives on a college campus. There are so many different walks of life. There's just people coming from every which way of the world, and it's truly important to be grounded and understand who you are, so that way you know and understand how to navigate these spaces. Over these past 4 years, I've been forced to have conversations with people who have different perspectives than me. And it's important for me to know and understand where I come from and know and understand where they come from, so that way we can meet at the middle. And I feel like with Trinity, for example, with a mission statement, connect, engage, transform, I feel like it's truly important that we do understand who we are and our place in the world, so that we can do just that, so that we can connect with people, that we can engage with people. And then at the end of us talking about our different perspectives, it's like, okay, now how can we work together to transform our communities? And I feel like over these past 4 years, I've done just that with knowing and understanding who I am.
Well, that's a fantastic answer, and I'm going to say thank you for talking about our mission statement, too. I mean, just to weave that right into your answer was very, very impressive. So I'm going to come back to you, Paul, because what I found particularly interesting about your book was it had some individual stories, like Matthew's, and I think there was one about a Kiki, but it also talked about meta-level data, and you were kind of moving in between individual and personal stories as well as kind of systemic issues. So just share with me if you think there are misconceptions about the admissions process that you learned in kind of moving up and down at those levels during your research.
Yeah, I think there are lots of misconceptions about
You can
about the
share a
admissions
few
process.
so we can try and correct them.
Yeah, so I'll sort of say two things. I mean, one is that kind of writing, that process is really important to me in my reporting. There are lots of different type ways to write a nonfiction book, and there are some people who focus mostly on individual stories and describe scenes. There are others who try to analyze big, data and trends and the news. And what I like to do in my work, and certainly in this book, is to meld those two things together and show how each perspective benefits the other. And so that's certainly a lot of what I tried to do here. And I think what happens when you do that is that, you meet individuals who in some ways are representative of larger trends, but are also individuals. And so that was a big part of what was fun and important for me about spending time with Angel and with Matthew. That Angel is in some ways representative of admissions people who are trying to change things, but he's also his own unique person. Matthew is in some ways representative of a first-generation student on a highly selective campus, but he has his own individual story that I thought was so important. So one of the things I tried to do was to let those stories go where they wanted to go. And in Matthew's case especially, I felt like the way that he found Hartford to be this great resource for him, the thing that kind of made him feel grounded here. I don't think that's true of every Trinity student, and so I thought that was just this. For me, that was unexpected in his story, the way that was the thing that first of all sort of turned him around, gave him a different way of thinking about this place in the world, and then I think brought him back in a more centered and more connected way to the Trinity campus. So I feel like part of the surprises for me were in those individual stories, and that's what makes this sort of reporting so meaningful for me. On the broader picture of what I found unexpected in admissions, I think it was just how many different forces go into the decisions about who to admit, not only at this institution but at every institution. I think we all have this idea that higher education admissions is a meritocracy, and that the one thing that admissions people are deciding is who is most deserving of a slot at this particular institution. I think we really base a lot, certainly high school students are encouraged to think that is how these decisions are being made. And there are a lot of other factors that are going into the decisions of who gets admitted. And financial considerations are right at the top of the list for a lot of institutions. And that is something I think that a lot of students and applicants don't know and aren't aware of. And I think it has sort of a dual effect for those students. One is it is a just sort of genuine practical obstacle that makes it harder to be admitted to highly selective institutions when you're coming from a low-income community. But it also, I think, has a psychological effect, because when you are from that community and you don't get in, you think it's because I'm not good enough and I'm not smart enough. And I think that is the message that higher education often sends to students in from those communities. And understanding all of the other pressures that are playing into the system, especially financial pressures, I think more sort of transparency about that process, I think, would change all of our perspective on what admissions means.
Right. I suspect, clearly the story that you shared was not a surprise to me. I'm clearly on the insider
Right.
of, higher education. But I suspect that the story and the way that it was shared was quite a surprise to a lot of people outside of higher education and the admissions process about who gets chosen and why.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly, that was the response that I've heard to the book, but also to the excerpt in the New York Times Magazine, that people from lots of different walks of life, whether it was from higher education, whether from affluent families in the middle of the application process, from advocacy organizations, I think understanding the kind of nuts and bolts of admissions was not only news, but news that gave them a new perspective on how the whole system works.
Exactly. So, Angel, I'm going to take you back to, 2014, when you were thinking about the possibility of coming to a place like Trinity, leaving warm California sun to move to Hartford, Connecticut, the East Coast, maybe just a little less sun. Why? Why did you decide that this was a place you thought you could make a mark?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'll start, and I'm not saying this because she's my boss.
That
and
was
I did not queue up that question. No, really, I think people who are in my position follow good leadership. And, the conversation that I had with you about the kind of vision you had for a place like Trinity was really inspiring. Also, just meeting community members and knowing that this institution that's 200 years old and has such a wonderful position in the community, in the country, and in the world, who could do a lot of different kinds of things. There was quite an opportunity here. And it was also clear that the Board of Trustees and the President were ready for change agency. And that, for me, is actually really exciting. And then the other piece is, I met a lot of students when I came to visit, and I was really inspired by what they do here. And I wanted to make sure that I could give access to folks like this to come to Trinity and be transformed. And so for me, that was all really exciting.
But at that time, could you imagine sitting here, being here in this situation?
Absolutely not. No, absolutely not.
I know. That, I think, is what's so hard. So I think there's one last question that I have for you, Paul. I was reviewing the book last night. I had read it before, but there's certainly some stark elements, some elements of the book that make me wonder, is there hope? And where is kind of the hope, given some of the data and stories that you shared? So I love to end kind of on an optimistic note. So where's the joy? Where's the hope in the system?
Yeah, I feel like there's lots. So yes, it is a book that that I sometimes get bummed out reading, and I wrote it.
I didn't want to refer to bummed out if I was reading it, but you know.
But I also feel like there is a lot. Certainly in my reporting, there was a lot that made me hopeful. I mean, being at Trinity made me hopeful, and seeing what Angel was able to do in the constraints that he had has been and continues to be really inspiring. Seeing stories like Matthew's and the kind of personal transformation that he's undergone and the transformation that he has brought to Hartford and to Trinity is really inspiring. But there are other places in my reporting where I found lots of green shoots and hopeful signs. There's two institutions that I'll mention. One is very small and one is very large. So the very small one is a college called U.S.A. College, which is a relatively new 2-year institution in Chicago that is sort of an offshoot of Loyola University, which is a Catholic university, private university, mostly admitting a pretty affluent, high-scoring class. But they felt like they wanted to expand their mission to enroll a different kind of student. And so they created this 2-year school where the student population is entirely low income, almost entirely Black and Latino or Latina, and are all recent graduates of Chicago public schools and charter schools and parochial schools with an average ACT score of 17. And young people like that in Chicago and pretty much anywhere in the country are not being well served by higher education right now. There are almost no good opportunities or options for them. And so U.S.A. takes a very different sort of approach to higher education. They follow what Father Katsouros, the Jesuit priest who runs it, calls a very intrusive model. And very intrusive is not a term you hear very often from higher education professionals when they're describing their relationship with their students. I think mostly higher education takes the point of view that our job is to stand back and let students grow and figure themselves out. And at U.S.A. they have decided that is too risky a strategy. It leads to high dropout rates. And so they really get involved in their students' lives. It's a 2-year school that's a liberal arts, Jesuit-based education preparing students for transfer to 4-year institutions. They don't get everyone through, but they get a really remarkable number through. So that's one exciting one for me. The other, the big institution is the University of Texas at Austin, where I spent a lot of time reporting. And UT
Right.
Austin is unusual for a flagship public university because of the way they admit students. So there's this law in Texas called the Top 10% Law that mandates that UT has to admit every student who scores in the top 6% of their high school graduating class from any high school in the state, which creates this much more diverse freshman class than is true at other flagship institutions, because you get the top 6% from, a wealthy suburb in Dallas, that's one sort of student, but it's also the top 6% from schools in the Rio Grande Valley or in ranching communities in West Texas or in inner city communities in Houston. And so all these students come together, they all have some things in common, they're all Texans, they're all excellent students, but they have very different backgrounds, very different family resources. They go from high schools that have had very different resources, and they have very different SAT scores. But UT, by law, isn't allowed to look at those test scores when they're admitting them. And in the past, what they found was these divergences in preparation led to divergences in graduation rates, that the students who were coming in from lower resourced high schools with lower test scores were graduating at lower rates. And over the past few years, the university has tried to change that, and they've instituted a lot of programs that are aimed at first generation and low income students with lower test scores, and they've really transformed their success rates so that students who come in with the lowest SAT scores not long ago were graduating, 39% of them were graduating in 4 years. Now 63% of them are graduating in 4 years. So that's the same students with the same test scores who are getting just a little bit of help and support and attention from their university and are graduating at much higher rates. And that to me sends a couple of messages. One is how much an institution can do when it decides not to take a sort of sink or swim approach, but to take an approach of really caring how students do. It also, I think, tells me something about test scores. That, test scores, I think, the people who run the testing companies want you to look at that 39% and to say, we really shouldn't be letting these students into highly selective institutions like UT because they're only graduating, only 39% of them are graduating on time. That test score really is a good indication of their potential. But those students want you to look at that 63%. In other words, to say if these same students are admitted to a highly selective institution like UT and given a little bit of help and support, they are not graduating at a 39% rate, they're graduating at a 63% rate, and for them that test score is not indicative of their potential. So for me, what's happening at UT is exciting not only for the institution itself and for the students who are enrolled there, but as a signal, a model for other institutions in other states.
Right, terrific. So I don't know if either of you very briefly want to say what gives you hope in the admissions process.
Yeah, I mean, I think what gives me hope is there is so much more attention paid to these issues today. I mean, if you think about it, the fact that we're having these conversations, people like Paul are writing these books, I think there is an awareness and a call to action. The issues are complicated, and again, they will not entirely be solved by higher education. They need to start at different levels, but I do think there is almost this forthcoming movement around these really complicated issues. I think it's going to be for Matthew's generation to fully solve. But I do see, I see so many more community-based organizations all over the country, so many more colleges and universities like a UT who are saying, we are going to change this. And that actually gives me a lot of hope, and I'm hoping to continue working on it.
Oh, terrific. Any comments, or do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, what definitely gives me a lot of hope is just the fact that Trinity and other institutions such as Brown are building communities for first-generation college students, because I feel like that is truly extremely important, because if we have these communities where, okay, you're another first-generation student, okay, what issues do you face? Okay, here are the issues that I face. Now, what can we do to address these issues and continue to move forward? And just having conversations like this, having books that you wrote, Paul, it just continues to steer the conversation, just to continue to move past the statistics that are just sometimes scary to even just recite.
Right. So as we move into questions, the one comment that I want to make, I think, is following up on a word that I've heard many used kind of around the mics today, and that is community. And I do believe the progress that Trinity has made is because of a community effort. Just as you were saying, Angel, it's not a single person, it's not even a single group or entity. It's all of the groups, the administrators, the trustees, the faculty, and even the students themselves that are really helping to lift this community as a whole. So with that, I am going to ask if there are any questions in the audience. And here is, okay, I see one way in the back. I don't even see whose hand it is, but now there are two. Yes, you. Just
Here comes a microphone for you.
and the mic, yeah, so we can.
Thank you very
And you
much.
can direct it to any particular person or just the panel in general.
Sure thing. So thank you very much for this conversation. I'm Anna Terrell. I teach here in political science. I just had a question for the panel. If you could comment on how you think that the changes in the guidelines from the Department of Justice about the college admissions process, how those will impact these efforts to include, diversity and inclusion at colleges.
Well, you're going straight to the heart of the issue, aren't you there? That wasn't like an easy softball question to get us started. Who would like to take that on? Angel.
Sure. I'll start because I'm living this every day.
Right.
So for those of you that don't know, the Department of Justice forced the National Association for College Admission Counseling into a bit of a corner to remove certain things from its ethical code. And this is hot off the press. It happened 2 months ago. And so now there is going to be a much deeper competition for students. In the past, once we admitted a class, another institution could not go and continue to recruit those students once they enrolled at another institution. Those guidelines have gone away because the Department of Justice felt that that was collusion. To be honest, we don't know how this is all going to play itself out. I do think the landscape will become much more competitive, and I do think, in my opinion, and I was actually just reading something about this from the president of Macalester College, I think it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education this morning, his prediction is that the population that will be least served by that decision are low-income first-generation students who do not have as many options, for whom obviously price is a very sensitive point in the decision-making process. And the last thing I'll say is, what frustrates me about that particular decision is that it's not good for 17-year-olds. For those of you who have children, and that my high school counselor friends who are sitting over here can tell me as well, that 17-year-olds need structure, and they need to be able at some point to make a decision and say, this is where I'm going to college, and move on. But the college admissions process will now continue as a result of some of these guidelines.
Right. Have you referred to it as the Wild Wild West?
It is the Wild Wild West,
That's
yes.
coming.
We're still figuring it out.
Exactly. Richard, I see you have a question, and then I promise to come over here.
And please introduce yourself.
Exactly. And
I'm Richard Sugarman from Hartford Promise. I want to say bravo to Trinity for taking this on and being prepared to be a different kind of institution. Bravo. Paul, I want to ask you 1.5 questions, though. What's the one thing that you would suggest that colleges could do to make their cultures more belonging places for the students that we're talking about? What's the one? And I would also ask you, if you want to answer a second one, what's the one thing that admissions could do to become more of an open, equitable process?
Okay, I'm going to focus on the first one. So I think I wrote a chapter in my book about efforts to to improve graduation rates at different institutions. That's where I wrote about Arupe and where I wrote about the University of Texas. And in some ways, efforts to improve graduation rates are by definition trying to make campuses more welcoming, more inclusive, more crafting more of a sense of belonging for students. And what made that chapter sort of hard to write is that when I started doing that kind of reporting, I was looking for sort of like great magic bullets, like for some program that someone had invented where you could just introduce one type of intervention, one particular message, one particular sort of summer program that was going to transform everything. And my impression is that those don't really exist, but that there are lots of things that colleges can do that make a big difference. And I think the reason that there is no sort of simple solution and simple answer is that the reality is, if you are a young person, especially from a first-generation family, attending a selective institution where you, by definition, don't necessarily feel like you belong, like you fit in, like there are a lot of other people like you, there are all kinds of obstacles you face, all kinds of messages that you get that make you feel like I don't belong, I can't connect here. My conversations with Matthew in his freshman year, he was feeling that all the time, being exposed to those sorts of messages left and right. And I think for someone in his position and in the position of lots of other students here and elsewhere, there is therefore a lot of pressure to feel like this can't change. I can't possibly belong here. I can't possibly fit in. And I think what happened for Matthew and what happens for lots of other students is that at that moment, there is some kind of handhold that they're able to find in the institution that says things can be different, things can change. There is a way for you to connect and belong here. And the reality is that can come in lots of different ways. I mean, usually I think it comes through the presence of an adult or a peer at the institution having a face-to-face conversation. That's how most of us feel a sense of belonging, when there is another caring individual out there saying, like, you belong here because I want you to belong here. And so that is hard to replicate. It's hard to systematize. It's hard to do cheaply. But I think it's what it takes, because these are humans, and especially young humans, in a moment of a lot of transition, with a lot of pressures, a lot going on. And I think the only way to really create that sense of belonging is for that to be expressed in a personal way, on a one-to-one basis. And so to quickly address the half question, I mean, I think what admissions can do in order to help make that happen is to change the demographics of the institution. The two things go hand in hand. So part of, I think, what Angel and Trinity have done is create a more diverse freshman class. And in the process, I think that makes those incoming freshmen who come from not traditional Trinity backgrounds feel more welcome. So that's an important part of it, but it's not enough. I think the institution also needs to go out of its way to very sort of consciously and purposefully find ways of making those human connections.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, Roxanne. And I'm not going to know everyone's name, so
Really?
I might just point.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying what you said earlier, that people on the stage right now are rock stars, because they are. And Trinity College is, as Richard said, for taking this on. I represent Hartford Youth Scholars, which is happy to call Trinity home, which makes efforts in the Hartford community to get more students to selective and best fit colleges for their careers. But the thing I want to say that Paul really touched upon, maybe the elephant in the room, is you said the highest resourced colleges still have the lowest percentage of low-income students. The places that could do tremendous good for those students if they could get on. And I see the barrier in large part, something else you alluded to, which are SAT scores. That sometimes really wonderful students who could do tremendous work, could be up to the caliber of it, can't even get in the door because they don't hit a certain score. And then before you answer, I just want to say the one thing that we've seen that's been tremendous with Trinity and other partners is linking up student employment. Not just that there are jobs for all students when they get to campus, but that there are jobs with people who are checking on them, who are making sure that they are fitting in, who are doing more than saying, turn in your timesheet, but, how was your week? And maybe some connection there with advising. We found that not just here at Trinity, but at other schools to be tremendously helpful, because it gives students resources that they need by having a guaranteed job, and also a caring adult who's looking out for their well-being and how they're fitting into the community at large.
Right, thank you. The only thing I will add is, for 18 to 22-year-olds, belonging is an issue. it's not just first generation. So many people come here and wonder how they're going to fit and how they're going to belong. So I think of it a little bit like the Yuri Treisman model, that when you do something for a particular group, you're actually making the entire community better. You think we're focusing on, you know, a diverse set of students or just first generation students. It's not. It's when we figure out how to do inclusion well, it helps the entire community and every single individual that is a part of it. So I just wanted to add that. Yes, in the first row, your question, or I'm sorry, second row. That's you.
I have a question for Angel, my friend.
Hi, Sarah.
Angel. Hi, Angel.
She's here all the way from Mexico, by the way. Just came in from Monterey.
Random coincidence that it worked out for me to be here today.
No, you came for this.
The last time that I saw you, you were still working in California at the other wonderful institution. But one of the things, when you had just accepted this job, and I remember how excited you were about your new title, that your job was about not just enrollment, but student success. Can you speak a little bit to how you think that combined role has allowed you to do the work you've done here? And do you see that happening at other schools? I don't. I visit a lot of colleges. I don't know too many vice presidents of enrollment and student success, and I wonder how you feel as far as what that tie-in has done for the work that you've done here.
Sure, great question. So you're right, I would say it's not a very typical model at small liberal arts colleges, but again, forward-thinking president, one of the reasons I chose to come here. But I will say it's growing particularly at larger institutions. I am seeing that title a little bit more at larger institutions. And I think a part of it is because as the complexity of the students who are coming in, the complexity of the work and the issues that we have to deal with, more and more institutions are realizing it's not just good enough to admit students, but if you have one particular division that is thinking about sort of the cradle to grave approach to make sure that students are coming in, but that they're also being set up for success, thinking about issues of retention and what are some of the issues that we need to support them in as they come through the experience, but also, and this is unique to Trinity, career development is in student success. So also, you know, thinking about how we set them up for success afterwards. It's interesting. I get a lot of phone calls about the title and schools who are interested in creating this model. And so I think you will probably see that model a lot more common moving forward.
Right. I think I'm able to take one more question here in the center. There you go.
So this touches on this is for Paul, and this touches on the theme. I'm Dan Douglas. I teach social and ed studies here. And Paul, actually, you reached out to me about your book at some point. You sent me an email based on one of my research about math in college.
Oh, excellent.
But my question actually concerns like the point of one of your points of hope at the end about the school adjacent to Loyola. And you said it primarily enrolls, or almost universally enrolls, low-income students of color, and takes this kind of, what I kind of read as a quasi-militaristic approach to like student engagement and student, and it sounds to me like CUNY's ASAP program, which you probably know a lot about. And so my question is, building on the theme of inclusion, which everyone across this panel is talking about, well, how is that? It feels uninclusive to me. It actually sounds like a form of creating, and this is a sociological term, ghetto schooling. And so while Trinity is, I mean, my students in the Soc Ed in Trinity are a diverse group, and I think they benefit from that diversity, that you've got white and high SES kids and students of color and low SES kids. Do we think of a point of hope as resegregating higher education?
Great question. And so definitely not a militaristic approach at all. I mean, the Jesuits are not known for their militarism. It really just has a very, very different sort of feel to it. But you're right. There is a real demographic difference between those students and Loyola students. And I mean, I think that what they would say is that they feel like they are serving a population that is a big population in the city of Chicago that is not getting served by higher education right now. So it's not that, it's not that they're excluding white students. It's that most Chicago public schools graduates, I think 84% are low-income students of color, and that's who needs services. So if you go to, Malcolm X Community College in Chicago, you're going to find a similar student population that, in my opinion, is being much less well served than than by the help that Arupe is giving. So yeah, they are trying to address big issues of segregation in higher education, and you could certainly argue that Loyola could just admit more of those students on their own. But I think the reality is Loyola's average incoming SAT score is in the high 20s, and if you just admit students with an ACT score of 17 and all of the pressures that come with being a low-income student in Chicago to Loyola without any kind of extra help and support, they are mostly not going to thrive. And so Arupe is trying to sort of be a transition from the reality of being a Chicago high school student to the process of being at an institution like Loyola. And their theory is that those 2 years that are a kind of inclusion. I mean, I think students feel that they are part of the Loyola community, even though they're in a different part of that Loyola community. I think that process of those 2 years makes a lot of those graduates, certainly the ones I spoke to, feel like they are able to make the transition into a much different kind of four-year institution.
Great. Another question. Yes, your question.
Hi, I'm a school counselor here in Connecticut, and also a first-gen student. Grew up down the street and spent many an hour in Trinity's library many years ago. But I wanted to say thank you to each of you because you each inspire hope. And Angel, I've been following you my entire career, so thank you. And I have a great story. I think you were sharing that some of these concerns begin K through 12, and they do. And I want to give a shout out to our school counselors in the room because I'm kind of hearkening back 15 years ago when my student Lisa was a first-gen student, first-gen Italian, first-gen Vietnamese. I called Trinity to see if I could enroll her in the diversity program that you offer each fall. Met with some resistance at that point, but advocated on her behalf, and she was admitted to that program. And my husband and I picked her up that Saturday afternoon, the weekend of the program, picked her up at her house, brought her to Trinity, dropped her off. She was here Saturday evening, Sunday, Monday, came back to school on Tuesday, and said her life had been transformed. She ended up applying, her need was met, and she had a fabulous 4 years here at Trinity College. So that was a long time ago, so the seeds were planted, and I think you've just grown everything good that could be, I think, developed for young people who need access to higher education. So thank you, thank you. I tell that story to many a student who are now doubting what their future can be. So
That's a
thank
great
you.
story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to say for those who need to leave at 1:15, please do so, but we will stay here for about the next 10 minutes and have a few more questions. Eve, I see you.
Hi, I'm Eve. I'm a senior here, and I'm a student admissions worker. And I was wondering from an admissions perspective, since I interview prospective students and do info sessions for them, what can I do as a current student wanting to bring in more diverse students to Trinity? What advice would you give me?
And who's that question directed to?
All of you.
I talk to you every day, so I'm going to turn this to Paul. She works down the hall from me.
Got it. So, I mean, I'm assuming Angel is giving you great advice on exactly how to do that, and more astute advice than I could give. I'd love to hear Matthew's answer to this as well. I mean, my answer is I think that you can give them two things. One is information that I think that a lot of first-generation students just, like all of us, but maybe more so, find the admissions process and the application process totally bewildering. And I think having, especially a peer, someone from their generation, be able to explain how that system really works is enormously helpful. And then the second step that I think a student like you can take is to begin that process of creating a sense of belonging. I think the process of applying to college, it does not engender a sense of belonging. It engenders a sense of exclusion. Even when you get admitted, you just feel like you are trying to get into something that doesn't necessarily want you in there. And so I think in all the ways that you can on a personal level, extending that sense of, you know, it would be great if you ended up here, that can mean a huge amount to a student at that vulnerable moment. Yeah. Matthew, do you want to add anything?
Oh, yeah, sure. I feel like another important thing is talking to them about your own personal experience, because I feel like what often happens is we talk a lot about resources, we talk a lot about support systems, but it's important to understand how we navigate and use these support systems, because what often happens is, say for example, you know, you missed a few classes and you're behind. And then you have a whole bunch of people coming up to you like, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And then you start to realize that those resources and support systems were there the entire time. But the fact of the matter is people just don't always know how to go about using them. So just teaching them how you use resources and support systems on this campus, maybe you can, one student could resonate and be like, oh, okay, well, now I know when I go through this sort of situation on campus, I know I can go about handling it this way, that way, and the third.
My name is Giovanni. I'm a junior here at Trinity, and I'm currently the VP of Multicultural Affairs on campus.
Yeah. And
in
lots of people have lots of good things to say about you, Giovanni.
Thank you. Thank you.
He's also a Hartford Promise Scholar.
Yes,
My roommate.
So in high school, you always have teachers saying, well, no one's going to hold your hand in college, so you got to figure it out on your own. And I kind of found that problematic because there are some students that do need hand-holding still in college to get them to where they need to be. So I had wonderful counselors in high school that taught me how to do financial aid and all of that stuff. But I was scared that when I went to college, that I would lose all of that. Like, who is going to help me do all of that? But once I got here, it was like every department brought me to all of these resources. I knew all the deans. They taught me what to do, like emergency funds and all of that. So I really appreciate the work that Trinity has done to make sure that every department is bringing students to every resource that they can possibly take advantage of on campus. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I'll take your question.
Here, having just retired from Brown University and having been around some of the Ivies throughout my career, I was really disappointed and really discouraged when you delved into the data about what's happening in the Ivies, and that it's 8% for 25 years or more, 35 years. And all the lip service that we get from presidents at these elite campuses, that they're doing so much. Oh, Princeton's going to be need blind. Oh, Brown would like to be need blind. You know, it feels like a sham, and it makes me really angry. And if people want to make a sincere commitment to social justice and educational equality and equity, it makes me feel like we should just leave the Ivies alone, that they're off doing something in La La Land that we can't impact, and that there are other institutions like Aruba and UT and Trinity that are doing important work, and we need to kind of get the word out so that the donor dollars come here instead of going there.
Well, I'm going to start with that, even though I'm the moderator. And so, first of all, yes, any donor dollars that want to come to Trinity, please know I will accept them. However, I'm just going to make one statement before I pass it on about the Ivy League. And that is a significant problem is not always whom they accept, but who applies. And the applications to the Ivies are not nearly as diverse as you would think. And one of the things I think that we can focus on in the most elite institutions that are need blind is to make sure that people believe and feel that they should apply to these institutions and they can thrive. that it's not merely those institutions putting up a barrier. It's actually making sure that all of you who are college counselors are guiding people to some of those kinds of institutions, because many of them would indeed be accepted, but it is surprising that there's not always the application pool that they'd like to see at some of them. So I'm just defending them a small amount, but there's a lot of complexity to your, and I think it's a more complicated problem than, you know, Ivy's bad, us good.
Well, I appreciate that, but
Right.
Yeah, so I'm less willing to let them off the hook than you are. Though, you know, you have to hang
These
out
are
with
my
other.
fellow
Yeah, exactly. You got to hang out with
presidents,
other
you
college
know.
presidents. You got to. Yeah. So. You know, I think it is complicated. The reality of those institutions is genuinely complicated. But I do feel like there is a real disconnect between the way those institutions talk about their diversity and what you see in the numbers. And so the 8% you were referring to is this this fascinating number that I heard about in a speech that I forget the name of the admission. Do you remember his name at NACAC?
Sean Harper at
Sean
University of
Harper,
Southern
right,
California.
at University of Southern
Sure.
California, who talked about how all of the Ivy League schools and similar schools had either 6 or 7 or 8% of their undergraduate student bodies were African American, and he said that felt to him like a quota, like a limit, like a ceiling that those institutions had placed on those admissions. And, you know, absent a lawsuit, we're not going to find out whether that's true or not, or whether it's just a coincidence, but it does, I think he's right to say it does feel like more than a coincidence. But the numbers that I found more striking were the numbers that came out in Raj Chetty and John Friedman's, the economists who looked through decades of IRS tax records and were able to show the financial, in terms of family income, what the demographics of those institutions were, and saw that at many Ivy Plus institutions, as they call them, the students from the top economic quintile made up about between 2/3 and 3/4 of each undergraduate student body, and students from the bottom income quintile made up 2 or 3 or 4% of the student body. And so those numbers for me really undercut my faith in the kind of rhetoric that I think a lot of those institutions had about diversity and inclusion. You know, I think it's a good sign that those institutions think they need to talk about it, and I think there are lots of ways that they are taking steps to improve their socioeconomic diversity, but there's an enormous amount more that they can do. I mean, one of the things that struck me so much being at Trinity was how much of an obstacle an institution's finances are to admitting the students that they want to admit. That is not an obstacle at Harvard, you know, not when they're getting the $350 million donations to their endowment. There is a whole lot more that they could do. And I think it's true that you know, not all of the students who could thrive there are applying, but there are lots that are being rejected and who could be admitted and who could thrive absolutely at those institutions.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask Angel how much you think the fact that most of these institutions we're talking about are not test optional has to do with how they select candidates and hence who they are going to be able to admit. I mean, do you think that is a significant factor? Clearly, it's something we changed here at Trinity, but how about
Yeah,
talking
so
about the other Ivies?
you all know I'm a little passionate about test optional, so I'm not going to go down that path. But I'll sort of take it 30,000 feet, and if you read Paul's book, you'll understand a little bit more about why this is complex. You know, the thing that is interesting to me about the system of higher education that we've set up in America, particularly with the U.S. News and rankings and all the pressures that we're under, is that we actually reward institutions for the incoming, not the output.
Exactly.
And so think about it this way. How many hospitals are evaluated on how healthy people are when they come in the door, right? No, it's about what is the transformation when they leave. And so, you know, institutions like the Ivy League and those institutions that have a lot of pressure, particularly around testing, they have different points of pressure because what they see as success And what this country has really created is this narrative around you are a good institution if the students who are coming into your doorstep have this particular test score. And you know, this is going to be controversial in a highly selective environment, but I'm going to say, I've said it at every institution I've worked at. Every institution I've worked at, people say to me, particularly my faculty colleagues, they say, bring me the best and the brightest. And I've always said, well, what if I brought you the ready, willing, and able, and you make them the best and the brightest, right? But that is not the system we've created in America. And so they have pressure points. We all have pressure points because there are consequences to not paying attention to things like rankings. But there needs to be, we need to rethink this entire system if we're really going to make fundamental changes. And I do think we're at an interesting point in our country's history to do that because the demographics are shifting pretty drastically.
Right. And what kinds of, I'm going to let Paul maybe have the last answer. What kinds of changes are we going to need to make that happen in the country? Because I think that's ultimately the question you're trying to answer.
I think it is, yeah. And I think, I do think that there are individual changes that administrators like the two of you can make, like that you know, faculty and students on a campus like this can make, that will change things in really significant ways. But I keep coming back to the feeling that if we want to really make the kind of transformation that we need in higher education to make it the engine of social mobility that it has been and can be again, it involves everybody. It really involves a shift in the mindset of the American public. To think, I think we've gone from thinking about higher education as a collective good, as something that benefits all of us, to a consumer good, a private good, something that we're just supposed to compete for, and that you're purchasing for your own family or for yourself. And that kind of thinking, which I think is pervasive and that every pressure in the system pushes us towards, I think is really toxic to the goals of real diversity and real mobility and real opportunity. So that kind of social change, that kind of shift in mindset doesn't happen overnight. It's a big process, and I think it takes everyone. The good news is I think that none of us have to wait for Angel or for President Berger-Sweeney or for the College Board or for the government to fix it, because we all can take steps in our own lives, in the work that we do, in the way that we apply, and the way that we study to make that change one step at a time.
Well, that was a fantastic final answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you, and particularly to such an able panel. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you.